The sun was setting on a quiet Thursday evening when an off-duty internal affairs detective was heading home after a long day of undercover work. She'd spent hours investigating complaints about police misconduct, and all she wanted now was to get home to her family. Her dark blue BMW cruised smoothly through the tree-lined streets of the upscale Pine Ridge neighborhood, where million-dollar homes stood proudly behind perfectly manicured lawns. She noticed the first police car in her rearview mirror about 3 blocks back. At first, she didn't think much of it. After all, she'd been following every traffic rule to the letter. But then a second patrol car appeared, and both began to trail her vehicle at a distance that was just a little too close for comfort. Her years of experience told her something wasn't right. As she signaled to turn onto Maple Avenue, the red and blue lights finally flashed to life behind her. Her heart sank, not from fear, but from disappointment. After 15 years on the force, she knew exactly what was happening. She'd seen it countless times in the complaints that crossed her desk. A black person driving an expensive car in an affluent neighborhood. She pulled over smoothly, positioning her car perfectly by the curb. Her movements were deliberate and calm as she turned off the engine, placed her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and switched on the interior light. All the things she knew could help keep a situation from escalating. Through her side mirror, she watched the 2 officers approach, their hands already resting on their weapons. The detective took steady breaths, her mind already documenting every detail like the seasoned investigator she was. She noted the time on her dashboard clock, 7:43 p.m. She observed how the officers' body cameras were positioned, how they split up to approach her car from both sides, and most importantly, how their faces changed when they saw her through the window. She could have pulled out her badge right then. She could have ended it before it began. But years of experience had taught her something valuable. Sometimes the best way to fix a broken system was to let it show exactly how broken it was. So she sat quietly, her credentials tucked away in her purse, and waited to see just how far these officers would go. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just that morning, she'd been reviewing similar cases. A black doctor stopped 3 times in 1 month. A lawyer questioned about stealing his own car. A real estate agent arrested while showing a house. Now here she was, about to become another story in that too-long list. Through her open window, she could smell the crisp evening air mixed with the scent of freshly cut grass from nearby lawns. Wind chimes tinkled softly from a nearby porch. It was such a peaceful setting for what she knew was about to become a very uncomfortable situation. She watched a family walking their dog on the opposite sidewalk, wondering if they'd stop to witness what was about to unfold. If they'd become part of the story she knew she'd eventually have to tell. As the officer's footsteps grew closer, she felt a familiar knot in her stomach. Not fear. She'd long ago learned to manage that, but a deep, weary sadness for what she was about to witness. In her mind, she was already composing the report she would write, already thinking about how this moment could be turned into a teaching opportunity. Because that's what she did. She turned difficult moments into chances for change. The tap on her window was sharp, aggressive, and unnecessarily loud. What happened next would change not just these officers' lives, but an entire police department's approach to community relations. License and registration. The officer's voice boomed through her open window, sharp enough to make nearby birds take flight. His flashlight beam swept across her face, then around the car's interior, lingering on the leather seats and sophisticated dashboard. "Good evening, officer," she replied calmly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" The second officer had positioned himself by the passenger window, his knuckles white against his flashlight. "You were driving suspiciously," he said, though they all knew that wasn't true. "This vehicle matches a description we received." She had to hold back a tired sigh. In 15 years of law enforcement, she'd heard that excuse more times than she could count. The car description excuse. It was page 1 of the unofficial handbook on questionable stops. I've been following all traffic laws, she stated quietly, maintaining her composure. I'd like to know the specific reason for this stop. Her voice carried the weight of someone who knew her rights, but the officers seemed to take her confidence as defiance. The first officer's tone grew harder. Step out of the vehicle, he ordered, his hand now resting openly on his holstered weapon. And keep your hands where we can see them. A couple had stopped on their evening walk to watch the scene unfold. They stood under a streetlight, phones partially raised, uncertain whether to record. The detective noticed them in her mirror, potential witnesses to whatever happened next. Sir, she tried again, her voice steady despite the growing tension. I work for the police department. If you allow me to reach for my credentials. Oh yeah. The second officer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Let me guess. You're the chief's personal assistant. Or maybe you clean the break room. Their assumptions hung heavy in the air, each word dripping with prejudice they didn't even try to hide. The detective felt her heart grow heavy, not for herself, but for every person who'd faced this kind of treatment without the protection of a badge. She thought about the hundreds of complaints on her desk, each one telling a similar story. Stories of dignity stripped away by assumptions, of rights violated by prejudice. Last time I'm asking nicely, the first officer warned, his partner already reaching for handcuffs. Step out of the vehicle now. She could see their body cameras blinking, recording every word, every action. Future evidence of what happens when bias overrides training, when assumptions replace proper procedure. The irony was almost painful. These officers had no idea they were creating their own case file with every passing second. Red and blue lights continued to paint the peaceful neighborhood in harsh colors. More neighbors had gathered now, watching from their perfectly trimmed lawns. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. The detective knew how this looked, how it always looked. Another black person being harassed in a neighborhood where some thought they didn't belong. The night air had grown colder, or maybe it was just the chill of the situation. She could end this now, pull out her badge, watch their faces change. But something kept her hand still. Every person who'd ever faced this kind of treatment, every complaint she'd investigated, every story that ended in hurt and injustice. They didn't have a badge to make it stop. As the officers grew more agitated, she made a decision. This wouldn't just be another incident report. This would become a teaching moment, one that these officers would never forget. Sometimes, the best lessons come from walking right into the trap you've set for yourself. The handcuffs jingled as the second officer stepped closer. In just a few moments, everything was about to change. The detective took one last look at the gathering crowd before slowly opening her car door. She moved with deliberate care, knowing that any sudden movement could make things worse. The evening air felt thick with tension as she stepped onto the street, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. Hands where we can see them. The first officer barked, though her hands were already raised to shoulder height. The second officer circled behind her, handcuffs ready. The metal gleamed under the streetlights, catching flashes of red and blue from the patrol car's lights. I'll say it one more time, she spoke calmly, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet street. I work for the police department, and I'd like to show you my credentials. A small breeze rustled through the trees, carrying the whispers of the watching neighbors. The first officer scoffed. Right, and I'm the mayor. His partner chuckled, the sound harsh and mocking. Ma'am, you expect us to believe you work for the department. In this car. You know how many people try to lie their way out of trouble. She noticed a young boy watching from a nearby porch, maybe 12 years old, his eyes wide with concern. This was the kind of moment that could shape his view of law enforcement forever. These officers had no idea they were creating memories that would last a lifetime, not just for themselves, but for everyone watching. You're right, she said softly, surprising them. People do lie. But good police work means verifying information before making assumptions. Isn't that what they taught you at the academy? Her words hit home, She could see it in their slight hesitation, the quick glance they shared. The second officer recovered quickly, reaching for her arm. That's enough. You can explain all about police work down at the station. His grip was tight enough to leave marks. More evidence for the report she'd be writing later. She could feel the cold metal of the handcuffs brush against her wrist. The moment stretched out like a rubber band about to snap. Through the years, she'd learned that timing was everything in situations like this. Too soon, and the lesson would be lost. Too late, and things could spiral out of control. A car slowed as it passed, the driver craning their neck to watch. More phones had appeared among the spectators, their cameras capturing every moment. The detective knew this scene was probably already hitting social media. Another video of police harassment that would stir outrage and debate. "Before you put those handcuffs on," she said, her voice taking on an edge of authority that made both officers pause, "you might want to check my left jacket pocket." Carefully. Something in her tone made them hesitate. Maybe it was the confidence, or maybe they finally noticed that she wasn't showing the fear they expected. The first officer nodded to his partner, who slowly reached toward her pocket. The detective stayed perfectly still, watching their faces. She'd seen this moment hundreds of times from the other side, reviewing body camera footage, interviewing officers who'd made bad decisions, writing up reports about preventable incidents. "What is this some kind of?" The officer's voice trailed off as his fingers touched the leather wallet in her pocket. Time seemed to slow down as he pulled it out, the gold badge catching the light as it emerged. The silence that followed was deafening. As the badge came into full view, she watched 15 years of internal affairs authority hit them like a physical wave. Their faces drained of color so fast she thought one of them might faint. The handcuffs dropped from nerveless fingers, clattering against the pavement with a sound that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. "I'm the head detective of internal affairs," she said quietly, finally lowering her hands. "And we need to have a serious conversation about everything that just happened here." The next few moments would determine not just these officers' futures, but potentially the future of the entire department. The world seemed to stand still for a moment. The first officer's hands began to shake so badly he had to clasp them behind his back. His partner had gone completely pale, looking like he might be sick right there on the street. The badge in their trembling hands might as well have been a mirror, showing them exactly who they'd become. We didn't." The first officer stumbled over his words, his earlier arrogance evaporating like morning dew. He looked around desperately, suddenly aware of all the phones recording, all the witnesses to their humiliation. The tough cop act had crumbled, revealing two men who realized they'd just made the biggest mistake of their careers. The detective picked up the dropped handcuffs from the ground, holding them out. "These are department issued," she said quietly. "Just like mine. Just like the ones I used when I was a patrol officer before I moved to internal affairs." Her voice wasn't angry. It was disappointed, which somehow felt worse to everyone listening. The second officer's legs seemed to give out, and he leaned heavily against the patrol car. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have a family. This job, it's all I have." Tears began rolling down his cheeks, unchecked and unashamed. The transformation was striking, from threatening authority figure to terrified human being in the space of seconds. A soft evening breeze carried the scent of jasmine from a nearby garden, a strangely peaceful backdrop to this intense moment. The gathered crowd had fallen completely silent, watching the scene unfold like a powerful street theater performance. The young boy on the porch had moved closer, watching with wide eyes as the officer's tough exterior crumbled away. 10 years, the first officer said, his voice barely audible. 10 years on the force, and I've never, I didn't think I was. He couldn't finish the sentence, but everyone knew what he meant. He'd never thought of himself as prejudiced until this moment forced him to see his own actions clearly. The detective looked at her watch. Less than 15 minutes had passed since they'd first pulled her over. 15 minutes that would change lives forever. She could see the realization dawning in their eyes as they mentally replayed their words and actions, seeing them now through the lens of their superior officer's experience. "My office, tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. sharp," she said, her tone professional but not unkind. "We'll review the body camera footage together. Every word, every action, every assumption you made tonight." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And then we're going to have a very long conversation about what real police work looks like." The crowd had started to disperse, but their phones hadn't stopped recording. Tomorrow, this video would be all over social media. Not as another example of police harassment, but as something different. A moment of raw human realization. A powerful lesson learned in real time. The second officer wiped his eyes, straightening up with visible effort. "I keep thinking about my daughter," he said softly. "She's always so proud when she tells people her daddy's a police officer. How do I face her after this?" The question hung in the air, heavy with genuine pain and regret. The detective's expression softened slightly. Sometimes the hardest lessons came wrapped in moments like these. Moments when the shield came down and real change became possible. She could destroy these officers' careers with a single report. But maybe there was a better way to create lasting change. As she watched them struggle with their realizations, she began formulating a plan. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about punishment. It would be about transformation. These officers' mistake could become a powerful tool for teaching others, but only if handled the right way. The next morning arrived with a heavy weight of anticipation. The detective arrived early at her office, sunlight barely peeking through the blinds, and prepared the conference room. 2 cups of coffee sat untouched on the table as she pulled up the body camera footage on the large screen. Right at 8 o'clock, there was a gentle knock on the door. The 2 officers entered, looking like they hadn't slept at all. Their uniforms were perfectly pressed, perhaps an attempt to show respect, or maybe armor against what they knew was coming. The night's events had left visible marks. Dark circles under their eyes, shoulders bent with the weight of their actions. "Please, sit down." The detective gestured to the chairs. Her voice was professional, but not cold. The officers moved like they were walking on glass, carefully taking their seats. The coffee cups remained untouched, their hands too shaky to risk it. "Before we start the video," she began, "I want you to tell me what you think you did wrong last night." It was a teaching technique she developed over years. Let them speak first. Let them show what they understood and what they still needed to learn. The first officer cleared his throat, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been up all night, watching my own kids sleep, thinking about what I did. How many times have I done this before? How many people have I hurt without even realizing it?" His hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white with tension. His partner stared at his reflection in the dark surface of his coffee. "My wife asked me what was wrong when I got home. I couldn't even tell her. How do you explain to someone you love that you're not who you thought you were?" He looked up, eyes red-rimmed. "The worst part is, until last night, I would have sworn I treated everyone fairly." The detective nodded slowly, then reached for the remote. "Let's watch together. I want you to see yourselves through my eyes, through the eyes of every person who's ever been on the receiving end of this treatment." The footage began to play. Both officers flinched at their own voices, at the aggression that now seemed so obvious, so unnecessary. Every assumption, every sneer, every threatening move played out in harsh detail on the screen. The second officer had to turn away when they reached the part about cleaning the break room. "Stop the video," the first officer suddenly burst out, his voice cracking. "Please, I can't. I never knew I sounded like that. Is that really me?" Tears were flowing freely now, dropping onto his crisp uniform. His partner reached out, gripping his shoulder in silent support, his own eyes wet. The detective leaned forward. "That reaction you're having right now, that sick feeling in your stomach, hold on to it. Remember it. Because that's the beginning of real change. She paused, letting her words sink in. But feeling bad isn't enough. We need to turn this into something positive. She stood up, walking to a whiteboard mounted on the wall. Here's what's going to happen. Instead of ending your careers, which I could do with a single phone call, you're going to help me create something new. She picked up a marker, started writing. A training program. Real, honest, based on what happened last night. The officers exchanged glances, hope flickering across their faces for the first time. The second officer straightened in his chair. You mean, you're giving us a chance to make this right? Better than that, the detective replied, turning back to face them. I'm giving you a chance to prevent this from happening to anyone else. But it won't be easy. You'll have to relive last night hundreds of times, tell your story to every new recruit, face your mistakes in front of your peers. The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the blinds and casting long stripes of light across the conference room table. It felt like a new dawn in more ways than one. 2 weeks after that fateful traffic stop, the detective sat at her desk surrounded by stacks of files. Each folder told a similar story. Traffic stops, searches, arrests. But now she was looking at them with fresh eyes, searching for patterns that had been there all along. The two officers had become unlikely allies in her investigation. They spent hours going through their own records, faces growing more troubled with each file they reviewed. I never saw it before, the first officer said quietly, pushing away another completed spreadsheet. But the numbers don't lie. 8 out of 10 of my suspicious vehicle stops were people who looked like me. The detective finished for him. She watched understanding dawn in his eyes as he nodded slowly. His partner was at another desk, methodically entering data into a computer, occasionally wiping his eyes when he thought no one was looking. The investigation spread beyond just their precinct. Other departments started sharing their data, some reluctantly, others eager to be part of the change. The detective's office became a hub of activity, with officers from different precincts coming in to share their stories, admit their biases, and ask for help in doing better. One afternoon, a young rookie stopped by. I heard about what happened that night, she said hesitantly. The video. It's being shared at the academy now. It's changing how we think about things. She twisted her hands nervously. I wanted to ask, how do we make sure we never become what those officers were that night? The detective looked up at the two officers who had stopped their work to listen. They stood straighter now, wearing their mistakes like badges of transformation rather than marks of shame. The first officer stepped forward. Let me tell you about the worst night of my career, he began, his voice steady, and how it became the most important lesson I've ever learned. The rookie sat down, eyes wide, as he shared the story they'd all come to know so well. But this time, he added something new. Every morning now, before I put on my badge, I look in the mirror and ask myself, who am I protecting today, and who am I really serving? Reports started coming in from the streets. Officers who'd seen the video or heard the story were changing their approach. Traffic stops began to show different patterns. Complaints dropped. Small changes, but meaningful ones. Like ripples in a pond, spreading outward from that one night. The second officer had taken to visiting community centers on his off days, sharing his story with young people. I thought I was one of the good ones, he would tell them, voice thick with emotion. But being good isn't about what you think you are. It's about what you do, every single day, in every single moment. The detective watched all of this unfold from her office. She'd created a wall chart tracking their progress, not just numbers and statistics, but real stories of change. Photos of community meetings, letters from citizens, notes from officers struggling with their own revelations. Each piece was a tiny part of a bigger picture. One evening, as the sun set outside her office window, she found herself adding a new note to the wall. It was from the young boy who'd watched the incident from his porch that night. He'd written about wanting to become a police officer someday, not despite what he'd seen, but because of how it had ended. Because he'd witnessed not just the problem, but the possibility of change. The first officer appeared in her doorway, another stack of files in his arms. "Ready to dig into these?" he asked, then noticed her reading the note. He went quiet for a moment. "You know, my kid asked me something interesting this morning. He asked if heroes always do the right thing, or if sometimes they learn from doing the wrong thing first." The detective pinned the note to her wall, stepping back to look at the whole collection. "What did you tell him?" she asked softly. His response caught in his throat a bit. "I told him that sometimes the biggest heroes are the ones brave enough to admit when they're wrong, and then work hard to make it right." 6 months after the traffic stop incident, the police department's training room was packed. Officers from every precinct sat shoulder to shoulder, some taking notes, others just watching intently. At the front of the room, the 2 officers who had once stopped their internal affairs detective stood before their peers, about to share their story again. "Some of you might recognize us from the video," the first officer began, his voice stronger now after months of telling this story. "You know, the one where we made complete fools of ourselves and nearly destroyed our careers." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. But what you don't know is what happened after the cameras stopped rolling. His partner stepped forward, clicking through slides showing their investigation's findings. "These numbers represent real people," he explained, pointing to a particularly telling graph. "Each one is someone's mother, father, sister, brother. Someone just trying to get home, just like our detective was that night." The room grew quiet as they shared the details of their retraining program. They called it the Mirror Project, because it forced officers to really see themselves. Body camera footage played on the screen, not just from that night, but from other incidents they'd gathered. Each clip showed similar patterns, similar assumptions, similar mistakes. In the back of the room, the detective watched with quiet pride. She remembered how nervous they'd been before their first presentation, hands shaking as they practiced. Now they moved with confidence, their vulnerability becoming their strength. They weren't just telling a story anymore, they were leading a movement. "Yesterday," the first officer continued, "my daughter asked me what I do at work. For the first time, I told her the whole truth. Not just about protecting and serving, but about learning and growing. About making mistakes and fixing them." He paused, emotion thick in his voice. "She hugged me and said she was proud of me. Not because I was perfect, but because I was trying to be better." The presentation shifted to practical exercises. Officers paired up, role-playing traffic stops with a new awareness. The 2 officers moved through the room, sharing tips they'd learned the hard way. "Check your assumptions," they'd say. "Ask yourself why you're really pulling someone over. Be honest with yourself before you hit those lights." During the break, a veteran officer approached the detective. "I've been on the force 20 years, he said quietly. "Thought I'd seen everything. But watching these 2, he shook his head. It's making me rethink every stop I've ever made." The training wasn't just about that one night anymore. Officers began sharing their own stories, their own moments of realization. The room became a space for honest conversation about bias, fear, and the power of change. Some stories were hard to hear, others hopeful, but all were real. Back at the front of the room, the second officer held up his own badge. "This shield means something different to me now," he said. "It's not just about authority anymore. It's about responsibility. The responsibility to be better tomorrow than we are today." The detective's phone buzzed with a text from another department requesting the training program. It wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. What had started as one uncomfortable night was growing into something bigger than any of them had imagined. As the session wound down, one young officer raised her hand. "How do you deal with the shame?" she asked softly. "When you realize you've been part of the problem." The first officer smiled gently. "The shame isn't the enemy," he replied. "It's the wake-up call. What matters is what you do after you wake up." Looking around the room, the detective could see his words landing. Change wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. But it was happening, one honest conversation at a time. 1 year had passed since that fateful traffic stop. The detective stood at the podium in the city hall, facing a room full of cameras and reporters. Behind her, a large screen displayed the department's latest statistics. But these weren't just numbers. They told a story of real change. 12 months ago, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. 2 officers made a mistake that could have ended their careers. Today, that mistake has become the foundation of one of the most successful police reform programs in our country. The charts behind her showed dramatic changes. Traffic stop complaints had dropped by 60%. Community trust ratings had risen to their highest levels in department history. But more importantly, officers' voluntary reporting of their own potential biases had increased 5-fold. "We're not here to celebrate perfect police work," she continued, gesturing to the 2 officers who stood nearby. "We're here to celebrate honest police work, the courage to admit when we're wrong, and the determination to do better." A reporter raised his hand. "Officer," he addressed the first officer, "you've become known as the face of this program. How does it feel to have your worst moment become your defining moment?" The officer stepped forward, taking a deep breath. "At first, it felt like the end of my world," he admitted. "But now, it feels like the beginning of something much more important. Last week, an officer from another state called me. She'd seen our training video and recognized herself in it. She wanted to know how to start making changes in her own department." His partner joined him at the podium. "We've received calls from over 50 departments across the country," he added. "They're not just asking about our program. They're asking how to create safe spaces for officers to confront their own biases without fear of punishment." The detective watched as they fielded questions with a confidence that had grown over months of sharing their story. They no longer flinched when describing that night. Instead, they used every detail to teach, to connect, to show others the path to change. A community leader stood up next. "I've been critical of the police department for years," she said. "But I've watched this program closely. I've seen officers in my neighborhood changing how they interact with our young people. What made this program succeed where others failed?" The detective returned to the podium. "Because we didn't start with policies or procedures," she explained. "We started with people. Real stories, real mistakes, real change." When those 2 officers chose to face their biases honestly, they gave others permission to do the same. After the press conference, in a quiet moment backstage, the first officer's young daughter ran up to hug him. She was wearing a tiny plastic police badge, but it wasn't the kind you get in toy stores. It was a replica of the department's new badge design, one that included a small mirror-like surface, a constant reminder to check their reflections before passing judgment on others. "Daddy," she asked, looking up at him, "did you help make the police better?" The room fell silent, waiting for his response. He knelt down to her level, gently touching the badge she wore. "No, sweetheart," he said softly. "A brave person helped me become better, and that made me want to help others do the same." He looked up at the detective, who nodded slightly, remembering that night when everything changed. Later, walking back to her office, the detective passed the department's new training center. Through the windows, she could see another session in progress, more officers facing their own moments of truth. On the wall hung a simple quote: "Change doesn't start with a badge. It starts with a mirror." She smiled, knowing that somewhere across the city, 2 patrol cars were making their rounds. But now, before turning on their lights, those officers would ask themselves one crucial question: who am I really seeing in front of me? 2 years after the traffic stop that changed everything, the detective found herself back in that same upscale neighborhood. She parked her BMW in almost the exact spot where it all began. The street looked the same: beautiful homes, perfectly maintained lawns, but so much had changed. A community barbecue was in full swing at the local park. Police officers and residents mingled freely, sharing food and stories. The young boy who had watched from his porch that night was now helping younger kids try on police gear at a Meet Your Officers booth. His mother stood nearby, chatting comfortably with an officer about neighborhood watch programs. The two officers who had stopped her that night were there too, but not in uniform. They had been promoted to training supervisors, focusing full-time on the program they'd helped create. The first officer was showing a group of teenagers how body cameras worked, explaining the importance of accountability. His own kids played nearby, proud of their dad's role in making real change happen. "You know what the best part is?" his partner said, joining the detective as she watched the scene. "Last month, we had 0 complaints about biased traffic stops. 0. He shook his head in wonder. 2 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that was possible. A reporter was covering the event for a national news program. The detective overheard snippets of interviews as she walked through the crowd. Community members spoke about feeling safer, more trusted. Officers talked about feeling more connected to the people they served. The fear and tension that had once defined these interactions was being replaced by something new, understanding. "Remember this spot?" the first officer asked, walking over to where it all began. "Sometimes I drive by here late at night, just thinking about how different things could have been." He looked at his badge, the one with the tiny mirror surface. "If you had just reported us that night." The detective smiled. "Then we would have lost 2 of our best trainers," she replied. "Sometimes the worst moments bring out the best changes." She watched as his daughter ran up, wearing her own mirror badge proudly. The little girl had become a symbol of the next generation, one that might grow up seeing police officers as allies rather than threats. Near the park's entrance, a wall displayed photos from the past 2 years. The training sessions, the community meetings, the gradual building of trust. In the center was a framed copy of their department's new mission statement: to serve, protect, and reflect on our actions, our assumptions, and our responsibility to all. The changes had spread far beyond their city. Police departments across the country had adopted versions of their program. The 2 officers regularly traveled to share their story, turning their mistake into a movement. They had even been invited to speak at the National Police Academy, helping shape how future officers would be trained. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, the detective noticed something remarkable. The old invisible lines that used to divide people were gone. Children of all backgrounds played together while their parents chatted. Officers and residents shared jokes and stories like old friends. The fear and suspicion that had once poisoned these relationships was being replaced by genuine connection. The young boy from that night approached her, now wearing a Junior Police Academy t-shirt. "When I become an officer," he said confidently, "I want to be like you, someone who helps people change." His words carried the innocent wisdom of youth, reminding everyone that real change often starts with a single moment of truth. As darkness fell, the community didn't drift apart as they once might have. Instead, they turned on the park lights and continued their celebration. The detective looked around at what had grown from that one difficult night, not just a program or a policy, but a complete transformation in how people saw each other. Sometimes, she realized, the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of honesty. And sometimes, the hardest lessons lead to the most beautiful transformations.